A Questionable Sense of Self, researched and compiled by Austin Green. Buddha teaches that suffering is defined by craving, attachment, and impermanence. Since life is ever-changing within an ever-changing world that's full of various attachments, then it is the root cause of suffering. The question of self or no self is said to be misguided because any sort of self-identification leads to attachment and suffering. The core concepts of Buddhism consist of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. The Four Noble Truths are the existence of suffering, its causes, its cessation, and the path to cessation. The Eightfold Path is the fourth noble truth, the path to cessation. The first noble truth explains suffering is normal and unavoidable, and the second truth explains that attachment to desires is what causes that suffering. Cessation of suffering means to reach the state of nirvana and totally abandon cravings of any kind, releasing oneself from suffering. The fourth noble truth is the way to the cessation of suffering, called the Eightfold Path. Truth of impermanence. People become attached to entities that are ever-changing like themselves, and that craving usually forms into attachment. In order to progress after worldly life, then one must recognize the impermanence of all things and appreciate them without developing attachments. The self is one of the largest forms of attachment. Buddha's view of the self. Buddha views the self consisting of two parts called name and form. Name refers to intellect and instincts, while form refers to the physical body. They don't have any power of their own, but together they can operate when supported by one another. Buddha states that the cooperation of these produces what people call a man. Name would be the sense of self because the major part is capable of thinking in a higher state of consciousness. Buddha disagrees, and once name and form cease, they do not exist anymore because they are permanent and initially non-existent. The Buddhist doctrine of annotment. The Buddhist doctrine of annotment means no self and defines human existence in 5 categories: the body, sensations, perceptions, concepts, and ideas. There are 3 points of proof to supporting no self: lack of an essence, impermanence, and interdependence on people and things. Lack of an essence means that an essence cannot be produced unless all 5 elements are present. So the self, most likely including all elements but the body, cannot exist on its own. The impermanence of the world, feelings, and perceptions causes the self to constantly change, so self-identity becomes irrelevant. And last but not least, interdependence. The self is a worldly element that is affected by and depends on other things, so it cannot exist on its own. The philosophical meaning of self. The theory of self-consciousness states that humans are capable of being conscious of themselves and things around them. In this perspective, there is a possibility of self solely through awareness of oneself and one's thoughts. This is the reason why people are aware of personal existence, character traits, and standing features, and of the thoughts and feelings we experience. This theory of self-consciousness does not mention it requiring a body like the doctrine of annotment. Cartesian dualism. Cartesian dualism is a philosophical idea where any aspect of a man's thought could be classified as the mind and anything else is classified under body. René Descartes, I'm pretty sure that's how you say it, French philosopher, believed there is a sense of self within the mind, but it is limited by external measures of expression, such as language. Language, although complex, is a bridge for expression, but it's full of boundaries and lines, similar to Buddha's view of name and form, but does not reject the possibility of holding a unique sense of self. The mind requires a body. Self can be considered separate from external objects, but cannot exist in the absence of a body or a mind. The self must have a mind in order to manifest itself in, and a body for the mind to survive. All of the theories we've seen thus far have admitted to this truth, but one of them, Cartesian dualism, says that self can be separate, but it cannot survive without a body or a mind. The shared belief of death. Both philosophy and Buddhism share the belief of an embodied consciousness, or sense of self that resides in the body that grows and experiences up until death. This is impermanent in its purest form. Death is an unavoidable external factor in which worldly limits squeeze us. Even if there is a self, it cannot exist without an impermanent body. It's an obstacle on the Eightfold Path and cessation of suffering. The differences and similarities. All perspectives reviewed thus far admit to a sense of self in some form, with a single major difference of the self totally depending on a body or form. In Buddhism, the self is acknowledged in the Four Noble Truths as a cause for suffering and worldly attachment. Self is a separate entity within the mind because of its unique self-awareness. A sense of self can be separate but not unattached from a body, so it cannot exist on its own. A sense of self is widely accepted, but whether it is separate from mind or body, or if it lives on, continue to be points of controversy. In the philosophical theories we went over, the sense of self is initially attached to external life, but develops into a separate entity within the mind. Thank you for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed.